Got the request. Hi, Pragya.
Hi,
I
sorry,
can
we are
hear you. I'm
obviously off
terribly
to a
sorry.
rocky start because, yeah, so we were live on the Indian History Collective. Sorry, Rahil, Nonita, rest of you, if you can hear me, we've switched channels, so please join us here. But sorry, I was waiting for you there, and obviously you were on this channel. But welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pragya.
And
And I must take the opportunity firstly to thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I must also apologize because my Wi-Fi at home crashed. So I'm in a monastery in Greece, and I've just been able to smuggle myself into some small cafe. And I'm hoping that you can hear me, and our listeners can hear me as well. So I just wanted to apologize right at the beginning in case there's any noise. I'm hoping it will be subdued.
that's perfectly fine, Moin. And if you're expecting any sympathy for that, none is coming your way from people like me who've been trapped in this study for 2 years and unable to get out. So yeah, I think a monastery in Greece and a cafe in that monastery sound just perfect. Well, just before we started, I was giving our listeners just a little bit of context. The Indian History Collective is a platform that we started, a couple of friends of mine and me, we got together and started in 2020. The idea is to make primary sources, historical narratives by scholars, as widely accessible digitally as possible, as well as available and accessible. So we start with short introductions to the scholarly work, so there's a context in which they can be understood and they can be more widely available. And of course, the next step for us is to start translating them into more Indian languages to increase the sort of accessibility. We are available on a website, on Instagram, where you're listening to us, and on Twitter as well. I am Pragya Tiwari. I should have introduced myself earlier. I am a journalist. I'm the co-director and founder of the Indian History Collective and the creative director of Oijo. And of course, speaking with me today is Moin Mir. I will read out a short introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with his work. Moin Mir is a London-based writer of Indian origin. He began writing under the influence of his grandfather, Mir Hayat Ali Khan, a scholar of Sufism, and the great poets Omar Khayyam and Mirza Ghalib. Passionate about Urdu and Persian literature and poetry, Mir speaks regularly at major international festivals on Sufism, history, and travel writing. Deeply driven by cultural restoration, Mir is also involved in heritage revival. He's the author of several books, including The Prince Who Beat the Empire, How an Indian Ruler Took on the Might of the East India Company, which is a historical work about the Nawab of Surat, who resisted British efforts to usurp his kingdoms by traveling to London and exposing the East India Company's corruption. His latest book, The Lost Fragrance of Infinity, is about the dislocations caused by the decline of the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman empires and the impact of Sufism in India. This is our first live, and we hope to have many such conversations on the Indian History Collective. And I couldn't be happier that we're starting with this. Firstly, because even though we've never interacted, Moin, I'm a huge fan of your work. So I'm completely thrilled to be speaking with you. And this particular topic is very, very dear to my heart. While it might seem that Sufism hasn't lost relevance in the subcontinent, one sometimes tends to get the feeling that it has lost some of its essence. And that's particularly tragic because if ever its essence was of relevance, then it is now. So I'm looking forward to spending the next 40 odd minutes exploring the history and meaning of Sufism and what it really brought to our great country and how it helped shape our cultural and political ethos. I'm going to start by asking you, Moin, this is a subject, I believe, that's also sort of personal to your heart. You are of Sufi lineage. Would you like to just start by telling the audience a little bit about that lineage and what this subject means to you personally?
Thank you, Pragya, and very kind, very kind of you to introduce me with such wonderful words. I'm not deserving at all, But thank you again. And thank you to all our listeners who've taken the time out to listen to us. Sufism has been something that I grew up trying to understand. I still haven't understood it. I'm still studying it, and I'm just in Urdu and in Farsi there's a word called khadim, a servant of Sufism, and I can't even think of reaching a stage where I could say that I can speak with authority on the subject. But through my childhood, I was deeply influenced by my grandfather, who was the flag bearer of sorts of the Chishti Sufi order, descended from Hazrat Maudud Chishti. And Hazrat Maudud Chishti was one of the stalwart founders of the Chishti Silsila, as we call it today. And his shrine, which is unfortunately in probably the most ravaged part of the world, surrounded by violence, his shrine in Herat, which is on the border of Iran and Afghanistan, stands out as a beacon of peace, even in today's day and age. As I was growing up, I was given scriptures to read, to understand. I was given works of spiritual thought, of explorations into science to read and understand, all handed down from generations, and my grandfather had access to that. And so under his stewardship, I was able to somehow manage to navigate those rather complex waters of Sufism. And so yes, that's a bit of the lineage.
Your second book looks at the sort of loss of essence of Sufism in India, and we will get to that at some point. But can we start at the beginning? How did Sufism first find roots in the country, and what was the cause of its historical evolution and development, and the sort of linkages, geographical and geopolitical links that were at the foundation of it?
Well, there's a school of thought in Sufism that believes that the Prophet himself, as well as Hazrat Ali, who was his cousin, were the first Sufis. Now that's a philosophical thought where one looks at the two stalwart founders of Islam as the founders of Sufism, if you wish. The first forays of Sufism into India is something which is debated. It still isn't quite clear. There is one school of thought that believes that the first Sufis to arrive in India were the Chishtis, under the banner of Hazrat Khwaja Muinuddin Chishti, who lies buried in Ajmer Sharif, and his shrine in India is considered one of the most revered shrines. And it was under his guardianship that the Chishti order in India took root, and then basically spread its influence from Ajmer into Delhi, under the stewardship of his disciple Hazrat Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, whose mausoleum is once again very much revered in Delhi, in Mehroli, in Qutub Sahib, as he is known. And then from there, the silsila carries on, spreading its message of peace and love and unity of man all across North India. So you have Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, and then you have Baba Ganj Shakar in Pakpatan, which is in modern day Pakistan. But that's one school of thought. The other school of thought, which not very many people know, or probably tend to neglect, is that Islam, in terms of the Sufi way, came first into southern India. It came into Kerala first. And it came on the back of Mopla Arabs, who were traders, and the Sufis who believed in mysticism, who believed in the oneness of man, who believed in equality of man, who believed in these profound messages of bettering mankind, if you wish, traveled with these Arabs and landed in Kerala. And, that kind of philosophical input that Kerala had through the Sufis saw the expansion of that thought down there. So these are, the two ways in which the geography of Sufism is much debated as to how it started in India. The Chishtis in the north, and then the Sufis making an influence in Kerala. Which one is to be accepted? I accept both.
Of course you do. That famous north-south divide that will never be bridged, not even by Sufism. But I want to come to, and to me this is a very, very important question, at least for us to understand and appreciate, is that the Khankas of the Sufis were the bastions of knowledge. And I'm very interested to know what according to you was the contribution of Sufism when it came to knowledge production, right? And both materially and philosophically, knowledge production, culture, and politics in India. It's a vast question. It could be tomes and tomes of books. So it's not very fair for me to ask you to say this in a couple of paragraphs or sentences, but I still feel it's important enough to ask. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Thank you for asking that question, Pragya, because, in today's day and age, the concept of Sufism gets confined to, as Willie Dalrymple had once said, it gets confined to going to a dargah and then probably listening to a qawwali and enjoying biryani. And it's a Sufi evening. And and I'm sure those are wonderful evenings, but the depth, the magnitude, the impact, the sustained impact that Sufism had in terms of mathematics, science, art, articulating the importance of social sciences is enormous. And it starts with one of the greatest Sufis that was actually born in Spain, Ibn Arabi. And he was born in the 12th century. He was born in Murcia, a small town or village in Spain, made his way to Damascus, which at that point in time was one of the bastions of knowledge. And he studied there. And he studied two things. He studied science and he studied spirituality. And from that begins the burst of the curious, imaginative Sufi mind. So what made the Sufi's mind fertile was the fact that he was happy to be curious about the environment around him. And that took him into the science. That was his first knock on the door, if you wish, of science. He wanted to know where he, as a microcosm, as a unit that has been created in this vast universe, where does he stand? How does he stand in relation to the logic of mathematics? Where does that come from? Where does he stand in relation to stars? Not astrology, but astronomy. Where does he stand in relation to nature and environment? And my book begins with a poem of Seh Bedruddin, who was actually an environmentalist, and he believed in the concept of oneness with nature. Anyways, so with that, equipped with that fertility of mind and the ability to be curious and imaginative, the doors of science are opened, where the likes of a great Sufi called Abdurrahman Sufi was a 10th century Persian. And he was the first one to write a book called The Fixed Book of Stars. And it was his analysis on the constellation of stars that we kind of know in modern days times today. And his understanding of those of astronomy led Ulugh Beg, who was the grandson of Temur, to set up Samarkand's greatest observatory in the 14th century, called the Ulugh Beg Observatory and the Ulugh Beg Madrasa. And then after Abdurrahman Sufi was in the 10th century, you had a galaxy of thinkers, scientists who believed that spirituality and science are not to be divorced. Mathematics and mysticism are not to be divorced. And it's a very complicated thesis. But what they basically championed by one gentleman called Omar Khayyam, they come up with this concept that under the overarching arch of spirituality lies science, logic, reason, as well as inspired intuition. And from there, you see Omar Khayyam inventing the modern day cubic equations. You saw Al-Khwarizmi writing a book called Map of the Worlds, where he plots 2,400 localities. That's mastery of geography. And Omar Khayyam, was the first to identify metals and alloys and the relationship between the constituents of metals and alloys. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Yes.
Was I lost
Yes.
there, or? And
it was fine. There was just a lag, but you were fine. Yeah.
So Omar Khayyam is at this stage where he's able to deeply come up, deeply immerse himself in the love of God and the belief that God exists, which later on gets debated by the likes of Ibn Sina and all of that. But under that spiritual arch lie these fantastic fields of science and mathematics that are waiting to be explored. So these were the contributions. And might I hasten to add here, for example, Al-Khwarizmi, who wrote this fantastic book on maps of 2,400 localities and also, explored algebra in greater detail, unequivocally praises Brahmagupta, who was the Hindu mathematician of India in 500 BC. And Al-Khwarizmi says that if it wasn't for Brahmagupta, I wouldn't be forging these new frontiers in mathematics. So this was the fertility of the Sufi mind, where it absorbed, and from absorbing and learning, it enhanced and it propelled science and mathematics further. Sorry,
I'm really glad. No, not at all. I mean, you know it yourself. You've barely touched the surface of it, because even when it comes to, of course, their contribution to science and geography is lesser known, but even when it comes to their contribution to language and culture, we just think of Qawwalis, we think of a couple of Qawwalis even in that regard. We forget that even perhaps the language that we communicate in had a lot of a contribution from streams of Sufism. The instruments that we play, even in classical, Hindustani classical, etc. One can just go on and on and on, dance, etc. Everything. But there's a question that I was meaning to ask you later, Moin, but I'll bring it up only because you brought up Brahmagupta. When I was, again, one of the personal reasons why this is a topic very dear to my heart is that it's always been very dear to my father's heart. And when I was merely a child, he taught me the phrases Aham Brahmasmi and Anhal Haq. And you write about the assassination of Dara Shikoh and how it played a sort of very important part in what happens with Sufism in the subcontinent. You also write about Dara Shikoh being interested in Hindu theology as well as in Sufism. I'm interested to know the degree of engagement between Hindu theology, philosophy, and Sufism, and how these sort of cultures interacted with one another at various levels, not just at the level of theology, but also in terms of exchange of knowledge and ideas.
Oh, an immense amount of cross-pollination, an immense amount of cross-fertilization, and an immense amount of, dare I say this, respect and love for each other. These are most important. They respected each other, so let me start by looking at three great Sufis who immersed themselves in Hindu theology and Hindu philosophy. I will come to the favorite Dara, but bear with me a second, and I'd like to talk about two other gentlemen. One was Hazrat Abdul Quddus Gangohi, and his shrine is in Uttar Pradesh today. He was completely taken in by the Yoga Vashisht, and he was completely taken in by the concept of Alak Niranjan, which is the great unknown. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if the reception is good enough because it keeps cutting. Can you hear me, Pragya? Can you hear me?
Your audio is clear. Your audio is clear, Moin. It's your video that keeps pixelating, but we can hear you. Worry not.
Okay, excellent. So the concept of Alak Niranjan, which Hazrat Abdul Quddus Gangohi takes to his heart, of the greatest unknown, and there is even this belief that in the Upanishads and in the Vedas there is the concept of this supreme being that cannot be understood by the tiny minds of the human beings. And so he's influenced by the concept of Alak Niranjan. He then goes on to study Yoga Vashisht in great depth. And he's a staunch believer in the Qadriya order, particularly also in the concept of Wahadatul Wajud, which was the concept of Ibn Arabi of Spain. And Wahadatul Wajud basically means the unity of being, the absolute essence, which is exactly the same as Alak Niranjan, And so at this point in time, Hazrat Abdul Quddus Gangohi starts reading alongside the Quran. He starts reading the Upanishads, and he starts reading the Gita, and he starts understanding the depth, not just the depth, but even the common ground that these philosophies stand on. The basic of being man. What is that? You've been allotted a particular space in this universe or in this time space. How are you going to better yourself? And all of them talked about the same thing. So much so that they say, it is rumored, but we don't know for a fact, but they say that he was so influenced by yoga, Hazrat Abdul Quddus Gangohi, that he even performed one of his namaz in a yoga position. So, this is the depth of cross-pollination that was there. Then let's come to Ibrahim Adil Shah. Now, Ibrahim Adil Shah was a king based in the Deccan. And, for him, the greatest symbol of the beginning and the end, which is a cycle of life, was Lord Shiva. And he used to wear the Rudraksh. He used to get himself painted as a devotee of Shiva, as a devotee of the concept of the beginning and the end, which Shiva is, Then we come to Dara Shikoh, who a lot of people quite like reading. But Dara, while he is this enigmatic prince, who bears and who carries this incredible question of what would India have been if he had become emperor. We need to look at him through another lens, and that is the lens of a deeply compassionate, extraordinarily talented writer, and a deeply compassionate man. He, from a very young age, was influenced by Mian Mir and another Sufi called Hazrat Bari. And Hazrat Bari told him in no uncertain terms that your core focus has to be looking after the interests of the peasants. And he used to take Dara into the huts of the peasants to see in the abject poverty that this, that the classes, the peasants were actually living in. And with all of that, Dara came out an incredibly compassionate man. And so he wrote the Majma'ul Bahrain. The Majma'ul Bahrain was probably, his bravest piece of work, because in that he unequivocally brings about the comparison between Hinduism and Islam as one. He says, we have the concept of Ruh-e Azam, which is the great soul, and in Hinduism it is Paramatma. We have Ruh and they have Atma. We have Noor-e Azam, which is the light of the great, and they have Sarva Prakasha. in the end, it came down to being the same. So, so that kind of cross-pollination also filtered into, as you rightly said, paintings, poetry, musical instruments, all under the overarching narrative of being one, which the Sufis preached.
You know, while we're on this subject, I would also like you to help us understand during this time, what is the sort of relationship that the ideas of, you know, because Sufism is obviously very fertile ground in the Indian subcontinent and around. What is it's interacting, it's cross-pollinating with Hindu theology and culture, etc., etc. What is its relationship at this point with Islamic orthodoxy, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, and particularly in the context of the sort of contest for a sort of state patronage?
Thank you for asking this again, Pragya. This is a very important question, and the Sufis unflinchingly have always been at loggerheads with the clerics, and the reason being is because they were curious and imaginative, and the Sufis would accuse the clerics of being externalists, of being only guided by rule books, of being people who could only come up with rules and regulations and impositions and dogmas and rituals, whereas there was so much more to explore in life, as you know, through theology. And theology did not have to be a rule book. So they were always at loggerheads with them. The clerics thought the Sufis to be mavericks. They thought them to be, you know, sometimes even renegades. A lot of the Sufis lost their heads to the chatter that was infiltrated into the crown prince's ear about them. So, you know, this is something that has plagued all the way from Turkey to Iran to India. And when the rulers, coming to your question on politics, when the rulers back then kept the Sufis close to their hearts, close to their courts, you had the effulgence of culture. You had the effulgence of exploration. You know, the Ottomans were at the peak of their power because the Sufis were close to them. They encouraged them to invest in science and modernism, etc. You know, in Persia, to answer your question on politics, you know, Persia's last intellectual gasp was only when the Sufi is taken away from being the cornerstone of society. You know, and so is the case in the Mughal Empire. You know, Dada's assassination led to the cascading downfall of the Mughal Empire because it became myopic. It became too confined, you know, to just considering theology as rules and regulations and bringing it into state policy. So yeah.
You know, it's this is obviously at the heart of what you write about. You know, one of the key things that you touch upon in the book as well. When we talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the sort of Persian Sultanate, and we talk about Safavids and Mughals as well, right? You know, it can be seen, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. You know, did their decline impact Sufism, or was it the other way around? I would definitely like to hear your point of view on that. But I would also add another question to this, which is, you know, if at all, what was the impact of the coming of the British Empire on you know, Sufi practices and Sufi culture? And I ask this from a very, very personal point of view. To my mind, Wajid Ali Shah, whether he proclaimed himself to be one or not, was Sufi by nature. I come from Ayodhya, I come from the kingdom of Awadh, and our lives have been deeply, deeply influenced by, you know, the sort of broader umbrella of Sufi culture. And Wajid Ali Shah for us was the sort of flag bearer of it. And of course, you know, he was, you know, the British rulers were quick to sort of brand him as a wastrel and as somebody undeserving of the throne, etc., etc., and use that to sort of banish him from his own kingdom. That he wrote tumris and he danced Kathak, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. But of course, let's start with the crux of it, which is the impact of these empires declining and the progress of Sufism in the subcontinent.
So with the decline of all of these empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia, as well as the Mughals, you have a desperation that sets in. And you also have a sense of anarchy that is playing out, sometime in the early 1700s. Now, we must understand this, that when this is happening, you have the mighty resurgence of the West. They've had their Renaissance, they've had the Leonardo da Vinci's, they've had the Michelangelos, they've had the Isaac Newtons, and they are pushing new ground in terms of exploration, in terms of science, and even in terms of culture. Because the likes of Leonardo da Vinci are, taking a leaf from the book of the Sufis. And by the way, Leonardo da Vinci in his bio, many a time says to the one-dimensional Catholic clergy in Milan, please translate the works of the Sufis. Please translate Avicenna. Please, Ibn Sina, and he was known as Avicenna in Italy. Please translate, the Upanishads. Please translate these works, because these are the works that are inspiring me, and you're admiring my beauty, but you're not understanding where it's coming from. Anyways, the point that I'm trying to make is that once these empires start declining and the Sufi influence at court, as well as, in day-to-day life, as well as in the life of the university, starts diminishing, it is coinciding with the rise and the might of the West. And, the thing, Pragya, is that when the West is rising, it's vital for all of us to understand that, once again, they are not divorcing science from theology. They are deeply Catholic. The Portuguese Empire, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Dutch, they were all deeply religious. Now, obviously, they did a whole load of dastardly things in the name of religion, and a lot of people have done that. When the Spanish landed in South America, they annihilated an entire race. The same thing happened in Northern America. But what they have done, and what you have to give them credit for, is that they have looked at the East. Isaac Newton studied the mathematicians of India and of Persia, and so did the likes of Leonardo da Vinci. They looked at the East, they learned from them, they enhanced themselves, and they created revolutions in art, in culture, in mathematics, as well as in the Industrial Revolution, which came much later, towards the 1800s. But that period that you're talking about, the demise of the East and the rise of the West, is inextricably linked with the demise of the Sufi, in terms of getting his fair share of space to voice himself and to have impact politically, socially, as well as in universities where science was taught. Sorry, what was your next question? I couldn't.
No, you more or less covered it. I was talking from the particular point of view of the coming of the British to the Indian subcontinent as well, and if you had any thoughts on how that might have expedited.
So the British are coming to India, Pragya, on the back of superior technology. That's what they're coming to India. They're coming to India on the back of maritime superiority. The East got confined, and that's what I write in the book, the East got confined to its shrinking landmass. So for once, if we all consider ourselves Eastern, and by Eastern I mean Turkey, Persia, and India, we were the might of the world. We got confined only to a land mass, whereas the West had sailed. They had become maritime powers. and they had been able to navigate the oceans and dominate. And with that came, their advent into India, and then, British Indian history is known to all.
I'm going to ask you
if,
two last questions.
If I may just add there, Pragya, that and I think you've mentioned a very, very important period in time where probably you might not have given the exact date, but that's fine. But what you've pegged this on the British Indian, the ascendancy of the British in India. By that time, Sufism has shrunk to just becoming a visit to the Dargah. Sitting and listening to beautiful poetry of Amir Khusro and Qawwalis, which is great. It still was there, but it had shrunk to that. And it is also it also is in synergy with the shrinking of the cultural realm of we Easterners. I hope I'm making sense.
No, you are. I'm going to ask you two last questions. One is about the process of writing historical fiction. It's always a very, yes, it will be, sorry, somebody just asked this question. Mukul, it is going to be published on the IGTV as well as on the Instagram post. Most of our audiences end up watching it later, so it'll definitely be there for you to see it later. The process of writing the choice rather of writing historical fiction instead of a historical account is a very interesting one. There's always the question there's always that sort of friction sometimes between truth and fact, and historical fiction can help one navigate that friction. I just want to get a sense from you about the choice of writing historical fiction, covering this period of history as a work of fiction, and what are the kind of constraints that come with it, and what are the kind of liberties that you can take when you're opting for that mode of writing?
I was deeply, deeply inspired by Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. I have to admit, it was his piece of work that struck me with such an impact that I was convinced after I had finished reading War and Peace that if I had to write a book on Sufism, it would have to be a novel. Two reasons. Firstly, because when you are confronted with an enormous amount of literature, that starts sometime in 800 AD right till now, how do you put that? How do you put that and make that more accessible to people? Pragya, I didn't want my book to be just in the archives or just sitting on a shelf where a wonderfully enlightened young scholar goes, picks it up, reads it, puts it back with a lot of respect, and then it gets confined there again. No, the beauty of Sufism, the magnetism of Sufism could only come out through a novel. And I had innumerable amount of meetings with my literary agent here in England, in not here in Greece, but in England. And through those meetings, as I kept telling him about poetry, about ishke ilahi through ishke majazi, you are in love with a woman because you see such divinity in her, and Ibn Arabi was in love with a woman called Nizam. Hafiz was in love with a woman called Shakinabat. There is no doubt that Rumi was in love with Tabriz. How do you write that academically? You possibly can't. You can probably write an academic account on astronomy, which is just a small part of Sufism. But how do you talk about ishq? How can you write an academic work on ishq? So as time passed by, I realized that it had to be a novel. And then, of course, War and Peace was something which struck deeply. To the latter half of your question, what are the liberties that one takes and one does not take? I'm kind of, if I may dare say this, Tolstoy, I kind of tried to model this novel in that fashion, where you do not deviate from historical facts. You do not deviate from deeply researched philosophy. You quote the philosophers, you quote the dates, you quote the historical aspects, but you embed your fictional characters in that backdrop. So, while Muhammad Shah Rangila, the emperor, is a part of the first part of the book, you will not hear me putting words in Muhammad Shah Rangila's mouth. Do you know what I mean? You will not hear me quoting him, because that would not be quite right. So the liberty that one takes is around the ambience, or the feel, or when you describe a woman's beauty, that's where you take the liberty. You don't take liberty on thoroughly researched philosophy, poetry, and academic achievements. Those are quoted. So, yeah.
That's an excellently made point. Rana Appa saying that we also relate much more to storytelling and poetry, and that is what takes the book out of the confines of dusty libraries into people's homes and hearts. But of course, the main point is, how do you write about Ishq academically? Final question to you, Moin. What I started this conversation by saying that the relevance of Sufism isn't lost in this country. Sufism isn't lost in this country. I'm talking particularly this country because that's closest to mine. But
sorry,
perhaps the essence might have been.
Sorry.
So, to your mind, I was saying that even though Sufism, as persists in our vocabulary, in our imagination, perhaps somewhere we've lost the essence of Sufism. Am I audible?
Yeah, very much. Thank you.
So I just wanted to hear from you, one, about what is the continued relevance of Sufism in the subcontinent, particularly in India, and what might be some of the major gaps in our understanding of Sufism today?
Lovely question. I think I think Sufism is still very much there in the subcontinent. It's lost relevance, yes, but it's there, and there's a difference. So yes, every time you visit a dargah, which is beautiful, and you listen to a qawwali, it's fabulous. But dig deeper, try and understand and get hands on the works, the theological works of these fantastic Sufis. Understand the meanings of Khusro's poems. Understand what the Sufis meant by Wahadatul Wajud, the unity of being. What they meant when they said the essence of the attribute of the Supreme is present in everyone. What did they mean when they created these fantastic geometric tiles? There's one academic way of reading it, which is exact shapes and right angles and all of that. But the mystical writings about these fantastic tiles was about different shapes represent the diversity of mankind. And when you interlock hexagons, pentagons, triangles, squares, you create this pattern of infinity. And that is your journey as a human being. It is your journey to better yourself. It is your journey to polish your soul. It is your journey to understand how you as man can explore science and mathematics for the betterment of mankind. It is your journey to just water a plant and quench its thirst. That is the heartbeat of Sufism. And if we all make that effort to just take that extra step in understanding the philosophy, I think we would have taken a step in just being better human beings.
Well, your book certainly makes that effort and makes a beautiful, much needed effort. Thank you for speaking with us, Moin. All those of you who are listening to this now and who might be listening to this later, please buy Moin's book. I promise you, this was a wonderful conversation. I had a great time, but it does no justice to the beauty and the sort of enormity of that book. Thank you once again, Moin, and thank you, Roli Books. Thank you, Priya, for making this happen.
Thank you, Pragya, and thank you all the listeners for taking the time out on your weekend to listen to this conversation. Thank you so much. All the best. Okay. Now, are you sure you want to end the video?